It's certainly been a while, hasn't it? Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. It's been a very long time since you have last seen me talking about something on this channel, talking about Doctor Who, but it's been a long time since anything related to Doctor Who was even aired, bar the odd trailer or whatever. So, you know, it's been quite possibly the longest gap between me ever uploading anything on this channel. But you know, I have recorded lots of videos in the past year, just honestly haven't really had time to edit them, to be honest, because being at uni now, I'm now second year, been incredibly busy. You know, even now I want to release lots of videos, but I just don't have the time, to be quite honest with you. Yes, just super busy. But I wanted to comment on this because it's the first thing we've had of Doctor Who in a very long time, and also it's caused up lots of discussion, in which, if you follow me on Twitter, you've already seen some of my thoughts on that, but let's just say it's kind of erupted into something quite divisive, lots of people having their different thoughts on it, and lots of people taking it, you know, quite in a serious direction, so I want to talk about that as well. But what am I alluding to? Well, Doctor Who has just come back with a Children in Need sketch. It feels like bloody ages since we last had a Children in Need sketch. I'll be honest, I honestly can't remember the last time we actually had a fully dedicated sketch. Maybe like Matt Smith era, like it feels like that long. Which is quite funny because back in those days when we first used to get them, I used to love them, and now I'm kind of looking at it a bit cynically, and I'm not quite loving the parody angle that we're going with. But I suppose that's all a target demographic. This is aimed towards actual kids who are going to find that funny, like I used to do when I was the target demographic. I know I'm a cynical old bastard. I'm finding fault with literally a 5-minute children's charity sketch, so I'm ultimately the real villain here. But yes, Doctor Who came back. It was our first time we've properly seen, in a dedicated episode you might say, stretch of footage, David Tennant as the 14th Doctor, in inverted commas. So this is the first time we've seen him, and the sketch saw us return to Skaro at the earliest point we've ever really seen it in the television series on screen. It's pre-Genesis of the Daleks, Genesis of the Daleks, you might say. And yeah, it sees Davros showing another Khalid his travel machine, obviously a Dalek, but it has a different weapon rather than the manipulator arm, the plunger. It has this weird claw thing, which Davros is quite happy with. Anyway, he leaves to go on a nice cute little date with Nida, and then the TARDIS comes smashing in. David Tennant stumbles out, and he accidentally breaks the cannon, accidentally gives the Daleks their name, accidentally gives them the catchphrase exterminate, and then to solve the problem with breaking the claw arm, accidentally gives them the plunger as well before heading off. It's a nice little cute little sketch. I think the whole idea of the plunger joke isn't something I'm particularly enthralled by. That's just mainly because it's just an easy joke, if that makes sense. It's very reminiscent of kind of comedians, something you would pick up on if you were to take the piss out of Doctor Who in a comedy sketch, but almost in the wilderness years, kind of in that period when Doctor Who was just a joke. It's a very easy target, and yeah, it just felt a bit weak. Like, it felt like it was very much kind of taking the piss out of Doctor Who rather than laughing along with it, which is something that you wouldn't really expect in an actual skit, made by the production team of Doctor Who. This isn't, an outside thing. So yeah, it kind of felt a bit like low-hanging fruit, and I can see the funny side of it, but also it is just a bit of a lazy joke. I wouldn't imagine this is actually canon, let's say. But yeah, it was cool to return to Skaro. It was nice to see Davros pre-Genesis of the Daleks, Julian Bleach in that role. That was really cool. Just nice to see a nice little added touch there. And it's been a while since we've seen Davros, but it may be quite a while until we see him again, but I'll get onto that later. But yeah, overall it was nice. As I said, some of it felt a bit too much like self-parody and just kind of laziness there, but overall it was a nice little sketch. There was actual production values to it. The set looked quite nice, shot very well. Genesis Dalek looked as good in the modern day as it did back in the 70s. So yeah, all good stuff really. The only thing is the music was awful really. It was weirdly comedic, but really out of place. It's like, yes, we know it's a comedy sketch, Murray. Come on. But yeah, overall it was nice. David Tennant was just playing David Tennant's Doctor. But, you know, as much as I've been very sceptical, and I'm still sceptical about those sorts of aspects, at the end of the day, I do still have an affinity for David Tennant's Doctor. He is great in this part, and he just nails it. He's just got it, hasn't he, really? You know, as much as I'm not fully on board with bringing him back, you guys will know my thoughts on that. At the end of the day, there's no disrespect to David Tennant and his ability to play the Doctor, because he just gets this part like few others really have. Anyway, let's talk about what people are actually talking about this, and it's not really in the sketch itself. Now, if you saw Davros, you'd know he's just a dude in this one, because it's pre his disfigurement, it's pre Jesus as Daleks, pre any of that. Which, in terms of lore-wise, is a bit odd, because the Dalek design actually came after he became disfigured, because it was the base in his, you know, wheelchair, for lack of a better word. You know, the kind of Dalek base. The whole thing is he designs the Daleks based off of that base that he has. It's very much built in his own image. So, lore-wise, the Daleks wouldn't be there. The design wouldn't be able to be fully formed before he had his accident. But honestly, that's just a pedantic fan brain. You know, this thing isn't even canon. You know, it's just a nice little silly thing. I'm not going to pick apart the continuity errors of this Children Need sketch, really. But yeah, so we saw Davros, you know, he's pre-injury. It's cool to see that. I think if you're a regular of listening to Davros and Expanded Media, particularly on Big Finish, where they often explore his period before his injuries, I forgot really that this is the first time we've seen a proper fully adult Davros without his injuries on the screen, which, because it's such kind of a trite thing to do in Big Finish, you kind of get used to that. You kind of forget that this is almost like a seminal moment. So that was very cool. But it turns out, despite having actual story reasons for Davros to look like this, apparently that wasn't purely the reason he's looking like this. So let's get into this then. So essentially what Russell T Davies is saying is that Davros, being disabled, he's wheelchair bound, he's disfigured, is playing into a very negative trope in media, and particularly in sci-fi, where the disfigured, disabled person is the villain, shall we say. And he viewed that as a very negative trope he didn't want to play into, hence that Davros is now not going to be disfigured or in a wheelchair. He's not in this special, and he never will be again. Yeah, I'm not so sure. And listen, what I would like to just say straight up is, if you agree with Russell and you personally feel offended or a bit uneasy with this element of Davros' character, I'm not trying to take that away from you. I'm not trying to say you're wrong, just because we may disagree. And at the end of the day, as I've said in this video, I actually don't think it's a simple case of Russell is right or Russell is wrong. I think it's a very complex, nuanced issue here that we need to talk about. But I don't think there's a case of right or wrong, which is why it's really irritating on Twitter when people really try to funnel it into that box where it's either you agree with Russell T Davies or you're ableist, or the other way round. You know, Davros is like this, and he should always be like this. He's so completely unproblematic, and the world's gone mad. You know, either of those two things I think is ridiculous, because I think it's so much more of a nuanced issue than that. But what I would say is, I think that while I'm very aware of the trope of, you know, it's particularly the disfigured person being the villain in media, it is a trope, particularly, you guys will know, with the Bond franchise, is that's really where, like, the notoriety of that trope has really stemmed from, is the Bond villains always having a facial disfigurement. It's become a trope and a gimmick, which is a word I'll come back to, become their thing. And even when it had bad press, even when they tried to move away from it with the Kreyn films because of this, they still couldn't help themselves, you know, going back in, dipping their toes back into it with Rami Malek, with him being disfigured, because it's a gimmick that they want the villain to have. And again, I'll get onto that, because it being a gimmick for a character and what makes them unique as a villain is something that can be extended to Davros, but also it's something we need to tackle, because that could be extended to so many different things. But anyway, we'll get back to it. But yeah, that's where the trope has essentially come from. That's where it's been stemmed from. And I guess Russell is essentially saying, akin to someone like, you know, Dr. No or whatever, Davros is kind of a negative trope because he's disfigured, he's wheelchair bound, and he's a villain. Now, I would disagree with Russell on that point, but also not entirely. I think, obviously, there is a very negative trope around people being disfigured, wheelchair-bound also being the villain, particularly people who are disfigured are often the villains. it's the villain, they decide to give them a disfigurement, often as, I suppose, the driving force of their plan, although sometimes it is purely aesthetic, which I think is the worst case scenario. When it's weeded into the character a bit more, I'd say that's less egregious, but it's all about the execution, and it's all about how much you care about that disability. And I think in terms of Davros, it's someone that I actually think, regardless of him being evil, you can argue that his disability, shall we say, his disfigurement, is so key to his character, and actually is really explored in lots of depth, in lots of nuance, to a point that while he is an evil character, if anything, he is kind of a positive representation of someone who is disabled or disfigured. But that's again another nuanced thing. I'm not saying that Davros being evil and him as a character is the best representation you're going to get for disabled people. That's not what I'm saying. Please just stick with me, because I will explain what I mean by that. But at the end of the day, one thing I do think is important to get out there is that I don't think it's a great comparison to compare Davros to disabled people. I think that's such a surface level comparison. I actually think you need to look deeper. You need to engage with the context of Genesis and the context of Davros as a character, because he's not just disabled. He's a war veteran. He's not someone who's been disabled at birth. He's someone who has suffered and gone through a tragic accident and lost, his limbs. He has been scarred by war. He is a war veteran. And that's a context that I think some people are really sorely missing. It's not enough, in my opinion, to just compare Davros to someone who's been born in a wheelchair, for example, because that's not the angle that we're coming at this character from, and that's such a blanket statement. We need to actually engage with the context of Davros as a character, and if you want to perhaps say that Davros is a negative portrayal of people who have been battle-scarred in war, that's an argument that perhaps we can have, but I actually think you really need to engage with that context to really get anywhere in this argument. He's a war veteran, he's not just disabled, and by engaging with that context as a character, we can perhaps find more flaws with Davros as a character, and you can still maybe have the argument of whether he is problematic, but also you're actually then, dipping your toes into actually who Davros is as a character, why he was created this way, and the kind of facets and nuances of him as a character that make him who he is. So yeah, I think that's important, really. And at the end of the day, Davros is a really funny one, because his disability is both essential to his character, but also not. At the end of the day, Davros was a fascist before his incident, he was a fascist after this incident. So you can argue that Davros doesn't need the disability, he doesn't need the wheelchair to still be evil, and that may be true, but it's also a bit of a paradox, because Davros is also so defined by that tragedy, especially in Genesis and especially in expanded media. So much of Genesis is about the cruelty of war, and there's no better example of that than Davros, someone who has a brilliant mind but has been tragically injured in the war. To the fact that he is disfigured, he has lost his legs, his eyes are burnt shut. To the end of the day, he has been blinded by war, as heavy-handed as that metaphor is. He, as a character in his elements, just feeds into the wider narrative about war and its tragedies and turmoils that exist in Genesis of the Daleks. So it is important to his character. And so much of his desire and drive to build the Daleks, he was a fascist before, but it comes from his experiences of being disabled, of being disfigured, of being mutated, shall we say. It's essential to the portrayal and the character, because Davros just being a dude, you've lost the appeal of the character for me. Maybe on a kind of a character perspective level, but I think so much on a physical level and so much on a performance level. I think so much of the appeal of Davros as a character, and I said this on Twitter, is that he's limited in his movement. At the end of the day, Davros is a guy, he's for all intents and purposes wheelchair bound, he's got no legs, he can barely move his hands, he's essentially blind. But he's so scary, he's so villainous, and that's all from a voice. A voice and a screen presence and a portrayal. To the fact that Davros is so, physically not there, yet he's scarier than anyone who is physically imposing. Because of his brain, because of his intelligence, the way he is as a character, he can be there, he can't even move, he doesn't really have any physical power, yet he exudes all the power in the world, the power of knowledge, and so much of that restrictions makes him such a brilliant villain. The fact that he is so restricted is what makes him so scary, because it counteracts your more physically imposing Doctor Who villains. At the end of the day, the Cyber Leader can throw you around and shout all these things at you, but no one's more menacing than just that voice from Davros. You've only got to look at the infamous scene where he's like, if I released a virus, yes, I would. He's there and all he's doing is talking. If he was just a guy that you could just take down, that would lose so much of the appeal of the character. It's akin to someone like the Joker, where the Joker, if he was physically imposing, would be far less interesting. What's so fascinating about the Joker is you could just take him down with one punch, but that's not what's scary about him. And it's the same with Davros, and it's the reason why by making the Joker buff, you lose so much of the richness of that dynamic. And it's why people saying is, if you were to have Davros just be a normal guy, then he'd finally be a physical equal match for the Doctor, but you're missing what's so interesting about the character, what's so interesting about Davros, not just in terms of his relationship with the Doctor, but him as a character, in terms of how he is the head Carlisle scientist, he's the head of all this stuff, is that he's not a physical equal match for anyone. Yet he's still there at the top, in charge, and people are terrified of him. He has so much power. And that is what makes him a truly fascinating character. Just from a performance level, you've heard the stories of Michael Wishingesis of the Daleks performing Davros with a paper bag over his head. He didn't want to be able to move, because that's how he channels his performance. At the end of the day, people saying, oh, wouldn't it be great to have Julian Bleach have more physicality in Davros? I don't think it would be, because I think so much of the charm of great Davros actors, Bleach, Terry Malloy, Michael Wisher, is that lack of movement to really bring that truly menacing vocal performance from him. There's so much of a nuance to what makes Davros such a fascinating character, so to remove that to just make him as a dude, I honestly think just on a narrative and character level you lose so much of the nuances and the metaphors of Davros, but I also think you lose the fear factor and you lose truly what makes him such an iconic villain and honestly stand out from all the other Doctor Who villains. He's the only villain, I think, where he could just be there immobile and you still feel terrified by him. So ultimately I don't think that it's such a trope that, in Doctor Who at least, that all these villains are wheelchair bound, because I can only really think of Davros who really exudes that aspect of it, and that's what makes him such a great and fearful villain. The fact that he is so powerless yet so powerful, shall we say. In terms of channeling that Davros performance from the actors, it's all about that physicality of lack thereof, and I think by removing that, Davros is just a guy, and not only on a character level, but on a physical level, you've lost everything. You've lost everything that makes that character interesting, and ultimately he is just a dude, he is no longer interesting to me. So ultimately, as I said, it's one of those things where Davros is both not really defined by his accident, but ultimately I think the whole makeup of Davros, just on a contextual level and also from a physical, practical level, so much of what makes him great is that design. And it's not just aesthetic, it's so much to do with that performance, and, just on a character level, his makeup as a villain is all based around that fact. It isn't just aesthetic, or it isn't just a silhouette, as some people like to try and claim. And ultimately, as I said, if he's just a dude, he's just some other villain, and so much of what makes Davros so great is lost. So on top of that, by just making him a dude, you haven't really cured the issue. You haven't really cured the issue of Davros being disabled, portraying a harmful trope that everyone like that is evil, shall we say. Because I saw so many people saying, just make Davros just a normal guy, because Julian Bleach looks scary enough that it still works. And I don't quite understand if people are realising the pure hypocrisy that they are exuding by that sentence, because at the end of the day, you have not fixed the issue. You are just switching one trope to another. Davros is no longer a negative trope of people who are wheelchair bound or disfigured. Davros is now a negative trope of people who maybe look a bit off kilter in inverted commas, who maybe aren't conventionally attractive. Because I'm not being funny, but there are people who look like Davros or Julian Bleach with no makeup. You know what I mean? There are people who look a bit like that, who you might say, quote unquote, have a bit of a scary looking face. And at the end of the day, we would only say, oh, they have a scary looking face, they're not attractive, because of media and what's been built in our mind of, at the end of the day, people who look like that are scary, they're evil, even if they've done nothing wrong. That's another very harmful trope. You're not actually solving the issue. You are just switching from one trope to another. You know, at the end of the day, you're not sorting anything out. And if you're thinking like this, you are part of the problem because, you know, you don't quite understand, you know, that everything is tropey, and so they're all built on very negative, harmful, often physical tropes in actual people. So saying that, oh, we can just make Davros just look like a freaky dude and not someone who's disfigured in a wheelchair, you haven't solved the issue, you've just shifted the goalposts. But also, in terms of if we're looking at Davros as someone who is harmful because of his disability, or someone who is harmful because it's a portrayal of a war veteran as someone who has gone mad with the power of war and has gone crazy and invented ultra-killing machines. If we're looking at that as a very negative portrayal of war veterans, which, as I said, I think you could, then ultimately, what other villains do we have to look at in Doctor Who to say are harmful? Are the Cybermen just a very negative portrayal of people who have to have, you know, synthetic replacements or synthetic enhancements? You know, is it kind of a dickish thing to say you guys getting synthetic replacements, you know, oh my god, you know, look at you, you're practically Cybermen, you know, that just to push a little bit further, you'll be Cybermen. Is that a bit of a shitty thing to say to all these people who have to get synthetic enhancements, synthetic organs, that kind of thing? Implants. Yes, it is. When you look at it in that image, that mirror, yes, the Cybermen are kind of shitty. Are the Daleks, being these little mutants, again kind of a bit, you know, shitty to people who are disfigured, or people, you know, who have been in accidents, maybe mutated's not quite the right word, but you know what I mean. Yeah, probably it is a bit. If you want to look into that angle, shall we say, then you can find so much stuff. Practically all Doctor Who villains are kind of really shitty, far-fetched interpretations of something based in the real world that affects actual people. And that's not just Doctor Who, that's sci-fi in general. Sci-fi is just an excuse to bitch about something in the real world by putting sugarcoating on it. And that's why so many people love writing it, and so many people find it fascinating, myself included. But you have to understand that that is what sci-fi is. So ultimately, if Davros is harmful because he's perpetuating these tropes, and as I said, I don't know whether he is or he isn't, I've just said that I think that him being disabled is key to his character. Whether you think that's conforming to the trope or not, I would argue it's more interesting to look at him being a bit of a shitty display of war veterans than a shitty display of disabled people in general. But regardless, I'm not saying whether he is or he isn't, I'm just saying that I think that's pivotal to the character, so to remove that, I think, just misses the point of Davros completely. But ultimately, you know, if you're looking at that and saying Davros is harmful, then also I think you've got to say, well, the Cybermen is harmful, especially looking at this angle where people progressively more and more in the modern day do need synthetic limbs or synthetic organs or whatsoever, you know, either by choice or just as a priority they need to. And at the end of the day, that's a really harmful thing to be saying, that the natural progression of this is evil and you'll become Cybermen. What a shitty thing to say. And there is actually a moment in Spare Parts where the Doctor kind of says the subtext in text, and the Fifth Doctor goes on about this rant about people having synthetic organs, and it's really mean-spirited and kind of misses the point of the story, and you're like, hold on, Doctor, why are you ranting about people getting breast implants as the starting point of the Cybermen? That's a bit weird. And as I said, there's lots of other aspects where, if you were to take this line of thinking with Davros, you can apply it to so many other things in Doctor Who, and you get a very similar aspect. So ultimately, all villains are kind of geared in this way, especially in sci-fi. Davros isn't a unique example of this. Also, one thing I would say, because I remember I put a pin in something and forgot to take it out, is that my idea of, is Davros actually a positive representation of disabled people? No. But ultimately, my point of that is that Davros is someone who isn't limited by his disability. You know, he's not perhaps defined by it. He still goes on to create everything he set out to do. He's still just as powerful, just as in control, despite his disability. He's not someone who's limited by it. So what I'm saying is he's not a parody of people. He's just a very strong character who happens to be disabled, if that makes sense. And whether you want to view that as a negative trope or not, I don't know. I wouldn't say it's a positive representation, but I suppose what I mean is it can still maybe be a positive representation despite him being evil. It's not someone like the Borad, which is just taking the piss out of disfigured people. I think lots of people are treating Davros like he's the Borad from Time Lash. He's not the Borad from Time Lash. You know, that is an abhorrent, actively parodying, taking the piss out of the disfigured people. This is not that. if that makes sense. So I'm not saying Davros is, a great representation, but I think in terms of, you could go that angle, you could say that Davros is a positive representation of someone who's disfigured and disabled while still being evil. I think the fact that he's evil doesn't make it a bad representation, because he is still quite a strong character within that. So yeah, that's just what I meant before when I kind of alluded to that. I realised I kind of put that pin in and I never took it out, so to speak. So that's kind of what I meant. And also in terms of gimmicks, because that's another pin that I put in that I should probably take out. I alluded to the fact that James Bond and his villains were given the facial scars and the disfigurements and whatever as gimmicks to make the villain interesting, to make them stand out, to not just make them a normal person. And that's very true of Doctor Who and its villains. And most Doctor Who villains have a thing, they have a gimmick, and lots of that, as I explained before, is probably entrenched in very negative stereotypes. Even just a guy that's cast as a villain because he looks a bit weird, a bit off-kilter, is playing into very negative tropes where if someone was freaky, you'd think they were evil, which has come from things like freak shows and stuff back in the Victorian era, where we used to look and laugh at someone who looked a bit weird. You know what I mean? Like, so many of this that we use to spice up our villains are all entrenched in very negative stereotypes, and practically all villains are. But also, all villains are given this because no one just wants to see a villain who's just a normal guy, because that's dull, that's boring. Especially in a kids show, all villains need to have a gimmick, they need to have a thing. And so many of these pitch meetings I can only imagine in Doctor Who would have started off with a villain being a normal guy, and it's like, no, he needs a thing. Especially with Bond. No, he needs a thing, he needs a gimmick to make him stand out. Now, whether you like that or not is another thing, because it's obviously drenched in very negative stereotypes, but also at the end of the day, that's just how villains work, that's just how villains are. Because if all villains were just regular looking people, that would be very boring very quickly. So, at the end of the day, it's one of those things like, yes, I wish there was a solution where we didn't have to keep drenching villains in these negative stereotypes, but unfortunately, it is just kind of how villains work, because you need to give them that bit of pizzazz, and as I said, us viewing these types of people as, a bit more jazzy, for lack of a better word, in our villains than someone who looks normal, is pretty fucked up when you think about it, and we're all guilty of it, but it's pretty fucked up the more you think about it. But sadly, that's just how we're rooted in our villain designs, and it is a bit rubbish that that's the case. But a show like Doctor Who is arguably one of the worst offenders at this kind of stuff, when you have to keep coming up with villains. Doctor Who is drenched in this stuff, really. Really, do we need to have a discussion about whether Doctor Who and its villains as a whole is deeply problematic? Which at that point, yeah, maybe we should. But that's the show, sadly. I don't think if Davros just looked like a dude, he'd have become popular, he'd be remembered, he'd be very interesting. Because unfortunately, so much of the notoriety of Davros and the notoriety of several villains comes from that aspect to kind of zhuzh them up a little bit. And whether that's right or wrong, that's just kind of how he is. If Davros was just a guy, I don't think he comes back, I don't think he's remembered. Sadly, that's just kind of how it is. Should that be the case? I don't know. But it's just in terms of more context behind it, Davros isn't the only one that this is the case of. If you want to have this conversation about Davros, you need to have a conversation about all the villains in Doctor Who. Because as I said, there's no size, fits all answer. At the end of the day, by taking that makeup off of Davros, you're then still actively trying to look for a creepy looking dude, which then perpetuates even other stereotypes. So you've just got to look at that. But then if you just cast a normal looking dude, then it becomes boring. So what do? I don't know. But so much of villain culture is entrenched in very negative stereotypes. And that's a conversation we maybe need to be having, but a conversation that I don't know if we'll ever find an answer to, because it's just so normalised that our culture is built upon it. I don't know if we'd have an answer for that debate, but maybe it's one we should be having. Is Davros harmful? Is he not? Kind of beyond the point, really, but if you think he is, what are you going to do about it? So this is the thing, I don't really want to answer whether he is or whether he isn't, because I think he both is and both isn't. I don't think it's as black and white as that. But, let's just say he is. what are your options for doing it? So one of the things that I would do, and Russell's already been doing, which I think is why this is so perplexing, is add positive characters with disabilities. If you think Davros is a negative representation of disability just because he's evil, then make some disabled characters that are good guys. And Russell's been doing that. Not only have we had that in the revival, but also we can see in the specials and in the upcoming era that Russell's doing that. You know, filter out Davros with some good characters, and therefore Davros doesn't stand out as a disabled character who is bad because he's not the only disabled character in the show. That's what I would do, and that's something Russell has literally already been doing, because at that point Davros isn't a negative type anymore, because he's not the only disabled representation in the show, which, you know, is maybe the argument you could have had before. You know, he's a negative type because he's the only disabled person you really get in the show, and he's evil. But if you were to give, you know, some actual good characters who are also disabled, then that removes that issue. And Russell is actually doing that, which is why I'm so perplexed he's taking this stance, because I think by doing that, you negate the Davros issue. But also, here's another thing, and I think Russell has almost taken the coward's way out here. And why I'd say that Russell took the coward's way out is because if you really want to talk about how you think Davros is a negative trope of villains who are just disabled because they're evil, which, as I've said, I don't really think Davros is, but, you know, let's just go with it. And then at the end of the day, maybe do a story that actually delves into and explores his disability. Have that be a key aspect of the episode. You know, explore that. How does that make Davros feel? You know, how does that define him as a character? Does it define him as a character? Actually try and tackle that issue head on, rather than just ignore it and push it to one side. By removing that aspect of Davros' character, you just kind of push it under the rug. You're not doing anything interesting with it. And ultimately, I think at that point you could argue, is that actually a bad thing to do? Because A, you're removing a chance for a disabled actor to play a disabled character. You're removing a prominent disabled character from the screen. And you could argue, well, Davros was never played by someone who was disabled. Well, then make him played by someone who's disabled. As much as I love Julian Bleach, Davros is a disabled character. He should be played by someone who's actually wheelchair bound. Yes, that actually works, and I'd argue that that is something that we should be doing. Should we really be having able-bodied people playing disabled characters? I don't know. It's probably better that Davros is played by someone who's actually disabled and can channel that character. That's great. So, yeah, do that. You know, you're removing that opportunity from someone. It's very reminiscent to me of the stuff in Doctor Strange, where, because they were so worried about the Ancient One, you know, applying to that Fu Manchu kind of racist Chinese mentor type stereotype in media that the original character was so surrounded by, rather than actually try and tackle that head on and remove that stigma from a very prominent Asian character and remove that harmful Asian stereotype created by the Western world from that character. Well, how about you just cast a white person in it? You know, you remove a prominent Asian character and you just replace them with a white person to get rid of the harmful stereotype of Asian people that exists in the character, but you actually haven't solved that. If anything, you've just created another issue. You removed a prominent, you know, character that could have been played by an Asian person and given it to a white person, and you've just created your own issues. You've actually not decided to tackle that at all. And then you've got the Shang-Chi writers who were like, you know, they did a similar thing in Iron Man 3 where it was like, there's so much of these Western racist stereotypes surrounding Asian people involved in the Mandarin character, so rather than actually try and tackle that and remove that stereotype, let's just cast a white person. And then in Shang-Chi you saw that, funnily enough, they were able to create an Asian villain of the Mandarin whilst also not having that weird negative racist stereotypes to do with Western people. It can be done when you actually think about it. And if anything, you know, thinking that you can't do an Asian character without conforming to a racist trope, it comes across as a bit racist. And you could almost argue that taking a prominent disabled character and thinking that you can't have them here being disabled without conforming to a negative trope, is that not kind of ableist? I don't know, I'm not saying he is, but it's maybe It's not great. It's kind of easy, you know, rather than actually trying to do something interesting with the disability in an episode that doesn't make it just a trope. You're just going to ignore it altogether. That's so cowardly, and as I said, kind of a bit ableist in my opinion. At the end of the day, I think it's so crazy because there are many stories in Big Finish where they really explore that. They really explore Davros and the consequences of a disability and how he feels about that. Does that define him as a person? You know, the story Davros with Tony Malloy and Colin Baker, you've got the I, Davros series. It's fascinating, and when you're really interested in Davros, he's such an interesting character. The only people to me who would say that he's just a trope are people who aren't really interested in Davros as a person, more just the look of him amongst the other Daleks, and be like, he's evil, he's disabled, must be part of an ableist trope. At the end of the day, Davros is so much more nuanced than that, and, you know, if you were to actually explore that in an episode, you think he's ableist, actually do something with that then, rather than just, you know, taking the coward's way out and not wanting to do anything with it. You know, it is a bit cowardly from Russell, I'm not going to lie, and as I said, I do think it's quite similar to those instances in Marvel where, rather than deal with the actual issue head on, you've just shuffled it to the side and created another issue. But also I want to talk about, is Russell just doing this for brownie points, which I think he might be, I'm going to be honest. I like the sentiment of, you know, at the end of the day, you don't want to have a disfigured, disabled villain on screen in a children needs special where it's all talking about, you know, disabled kids. And, you know, it would be pretty harmful to have him be there when the whole show is talking about disabled and less advantaged kids. And I completely agree with that. And honestly, if that was his intention, that's a very noble and heartwarming one in the context of children need. But also, the more you think about it, it doesn't really strike you as that, because if you were worried about that, maybe just don't put Davros in the special. He doesn't need to be in the Children Need special. Like, this is a character who only appeared twice in the entire history of the revival, not since 2015. You did not need to have him in this charity special. So if you were that worried about it being, you know, a bit, you know, not great to have him, you know, a disabled character, a villain, in a special surrounding disabled people, then, you know, how about you just don't put him in the special? Like, it seems a bit of a weird thing just to put him in there, just to not have him disfigured, just to kind of give yourself a pat on the back that you didn't really need to do. But also it's the fact that I doubt Davros is even gonna be in Russell's stories. He only appeared once in Russell's era, and ultimately he didn't even really care about him as a character. There's nothing explored about him, the special isn't focused on him. He's such an afterthought in that special. So Russell T Davies doesn't strike me as a person who really finds Davros interesting as a character, more just as a part of, you know, set dressing when he's with the Daleks, which is fine. We don't all have the same interesting characters, but he strikes me as someone who's not really going to bring Davros back in his own era, which is fine. But then why create this big spiel about, you know, if I was to bring Davros back, he wouldn't be disfigured, when ultimately I doubt you're bringing him back anyway. You know, it does really just feel like a kind of congratulatory pat on the back, just to give yourself a pat on the back. And I feel like that's a lot of stuff with Russell. It's a lot of stuff with Russell that he does this, and, you know, I'm not trying to say anything about Russell T Davies. He's clearly a very progressive guy, but I don't think he's the progressive king that we all like to hold him up as, because I don't think anyone really is, especially not a middle-aged writer who has written lots of stuff before. I don't think they're going to be the progressive kings, him or Moffat, that we'd like to think they are, because none of them probably are. And we can take so much of Russell's writing before in the programme to suggest that he's not that. At the end of the day, he's not unprogressive, but he's certainly not as progressive as we like to think he is, or is any writer really, because all writing is based in tropes, probably harmful tropes. But all writing is tropes really, and the minute you try to stray away from certain tropes, you realise that you're just falling into another trope, because it's so hard to not write into tropes. And I'm a writer myself. You know, at the end of the day, my university lecturer was saying, you know, if you've got a kind of middle-aged, dishevelled, you know, done with his shit type detective, we all know that character, and he's a bloke, my uni lecturer is instantly like, make them a woman. But then really you realise that that's not actually any more progressive, because the kind of dishevelled, done with that shit, middle-aged detective as a woman is just as much of a trope in media now. So you are just running into different tropes, you know, that is all writing is, and not all tropes are bad, and trying to avoid stereotypes and tropes is like trying to avoid the plague during, like, the 1500s or whatever. You know, you're just not going to do it. But yeah, ultimately, Russell's Who as well is all tropes. You know, at the end of the day, you've got, you know, some quite harmful stuff. You know, the Slovene, they're just fat people, really. He's just demonising fat people in that sense. The fat couple in Voyage of the Damned, the whole joke is that they're fat and one guy literally dies because he's too heavy and collapses the ledge. That is mental. That is mental to say, and incredibly harmful. That's not only obviously talk about the potentially ableist villains that Russell had. You know, you've got John Lumick, you've got, what's his face, Max Capricorn, I almost wanted to say Headroom. But Max Capricorn, even Davros himself, he brought him back as a bloke in a wheelchair. Russell has perpetuated lots of these negative tropes. You know, Cassandra's another one. Bloody hell. What a thing to say about, you know, people with plastic surgery and stuff like that, that all they go, the evil Cassandra. That is a mental thing to say. And at the end of the day, Russell's still doing it now. He's still getting stuff in the trailers of, you know, making fun of David Tennant being skinny. You know, oh, look, a skinny man. Is that not a bit harmful to people who are skinny? You know, that we're actively taking the piss out of them because that's fine to do? Not a great look, Russell, to be honest. And, you know, we had a lot of big conversation of that on Twitter. Lots of people thought it was kind of a bit dodgy. Lots of people said it was fine. But at the end of the day, you can't really say, oh, Davros is perpetuating negative tropes about disabled people and then actively take the piss out of people who are skinny. You know, you've got to quite understand that, you know, if you're going to say this, you're going to have to also not make jokes about other types of people in your era. And also, talking about negative tropes, at the end of the day, the male doctor and the female companion, it could be argued that those two roles are quite negative and steeped in negative stereotypes. The doctor, the leading man, your strong masculine male hero, who, you know, has all the knowledge, you know, has the answers to all the questions, you know, is going to save the day, protect the damsel in distress, you know, the younger, more inexperienced female companion, you know, who doesn't know what's going on, who needs to ask questions and constantly needs the male figure to save her all the time. Relies on him for that knowledge, you know, he's literally reliant on him for their adventures. You know, at the end of the day, you can argue that that's steeped in misogyny, and Christian will actively try to get away from that by casting a female doctor to have more of a network of companions rather than just the male doctor, female companion type. You add a female doctor with male and female companions and you completely remove that stereotype. But then Russell T Davies has instantly brought that back. He's instantly brought these negative tropes associated with the doctor and the companion. I'm not saying that you should get rid of that ultimately, but what I am saying is that he's clearly a man who dabbles in these potentially harmful and potentially steeped in not so great stuff tropes. So at the end of the day, he's quite happy to write in tropes when it suits him, but also he doesn't want to write in tropes when he wants to give himself a little pat on the back. So what I'm saying is, I don't think Russell's some progressive king. I don't think it's, you know, a great thing to not be conforming to tropes because they're tropes, because everything's steeped in tropes, as I've said, and the more you look at it, the more everything in Doctor Who is somehow steeped in a very negative trope. There's a very negative and old-fashioned portrayal of certain people. So ultimately, if you want to have this conversation, which we're all good to do, then you need to have a conversation about a heck of a lot more. So thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Ultimately, my goal of this is not to say whether Davros is problematic or whether he's not. I think my main answer is that if you think Davros is problematic, just retire him. Like, we don't need Davros back in the show. He's kind of run his race on TV. I love lots of the expanding media, and I'd love for the show to do interesting stuff with him. But as just a moustache-twirling villain, we don't need Davros back. He hasn't been in the show since 2015. He's not an iconic staple of the show that needs to exist in it. He's barely in the show, especially in the revival. So if you find him problematic, just don't bring him back. We don't need to bring him back. At the end of the day, if he does come back like this, we can have this conversation for another time. But ultimately, this conversation is a wider discussion about lots of elements of Doctor Who. It doesn't just, the buck doesn't stop at Davros. And I don't think the buck stops at Russell doing this while he's also done lots of other stuff, if that makes sense. But ultimately, should Davros be brought back? Should he not? Because he's ableist? I don't know. And as I said, my goal wasn't to answer this in this video because I'm not disabled, and I do think we should listen to the opinions of disabled people in the fandom who have a much closer attachment to this concept than perhaps I do. But at the end of the day, my goal wasn't to say should he or shouldn't he. My point was just to say, you know, his disability is so crucial to so many elements of the character. So if you do think he's ableist, then we shouldn't bring him back, because I don't think you can bring him back without it, shall we say. But whether he is ableist or not, I don't know. I think there's a for or against, and I don't think it's black and white. I think it's a far more complex and nuanced issue that I hope to have explored within this video. But yeah, thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, drop a sub, and hit that notification bell if you want to hear more from me. As I said, I've been incredibly busy with uni work, hence I have not made a video in a while. You may see more videos from me, you may not, I don't know. Let's just see. But yeah, if you want to subscribe on the off chance that you may get more content, you know, I will be covering the anniversary specials. Whether I do any more content than that, it all depends on time. Going to be real with you. But yeah, whatever you think, drop your thoughts in the comment section below. Let's start a discussion. That's almost fun, but let's not kill each other in the comments. Let's not, you know, start calling people negative names. Let's try and have a civilized, actual complex discussion in the comments. That's what I want, and that would be good fun if that can happen. But yeah, whatever, thank you guys for watching, and of course, bye.